Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Psych Monologues. I am Dr. Ray Mitsch, your host. And how are we tonight? How are we? I often ask my classes that when I'm getting started and I get this blank stare like, why are you asking and who are you? But how are we? Welcome to the podcast. Pull up a chair, get something comfortable to drink to keep you warm. Actually, we're probably not at that place just yet. And let's have a conversation. I want to talk about the focus of the podcast, which is exploring the intersection of faith, psychology, and spiritual formation. And that's an expansive topic, needless to say. But ultimately, in a lot of cases, faith and psychology are both within the context of spiritual formation. And the challenge that we have is looking at it with a Christian lens, understanding it very clearly through the eyes of faith, without sacrificing any of it. Now, I think in some cases when people are listening and they hear that the topic is psychology is in it, they think somehow that that's at war with faith and spiritual formation, when it really isn't. What's really key for us to understand, I think, is that it depends on how you're going to define psychology. Because in a lot of ways, psychology has been around, at least in the conversation and in the church for that matter, for 2,500 years. It has far outlasted what we talk about as psychology, which is the system and the discipline and the science and all the other things that really go with it. So I'm defining psychology under this conversation as the context in which we understand the whole person, not just the things that they think, not just the way that they behave, but so much more than that. Ultimately, we have to take into account the human heart. And I heard an interesting comment the other day. We had a symposium at CCU that students, I don't know if they like or dislike, at least it's a cancellation of one day of class, so I suppose that redeems it. But one of the speakers, we were talking about habits of the heart, and I have something to say about that, which I will say at another time. But one of the speakers said it, at the center of history is the human heart. And I thought, wow, that is an amazing comment, and I couldn't agree more, because the basis of everything that we talk about in psychology is the heart as properly defined by Scripture and how we understand it that way, so that it is the seat of emotions and volition and desires and dreams and everything that we would normally subsume under the big P psychology that we know today. And for a lot of people, I think they really do believe that psychology is at war with faith. But the one thing I will say before I get into my topic tonight is if humans are involved, psychology is involved. And the last I checked, when we talk about spiritual formation, we're talking about humans and humanity and the person and how we engage that person. And we have to be very clear about what it is we're talking about when we're talking about psychology, rather than the standard fare that a lot of Christians have in looking askance at what psychology actually has to offer us. Because quite honestly, in spite of the fact that you might say, well, you've got a dog in the fight, you're a psychologist, you've been trained at a secular university, while that is all true, I have also come the journey of faith. And I have explored a lot of the darkest places of the heart, including my own, and have found that the data, the things that we have learned, not the conclusions that are made by psychology, but the things that we have learned about the human heart are entirely applicable, not to mention helping us to understand even the things that we read in Scripture when we look at humans and how they operate there, including the God-human, Jesus, and the things that he felt. And that's something to pay attention to, because we always reduce the heart down to the emotions, but it is so much more than that. And maybe I will devote another episode in talking more about that, because it fits right in with a lot of what I talk about. And even the reason that I started this podcast up was to provide a basis to talk about spiritual formation, specifically what we are doing at CCU with the silent retreat, and that's the impetus behind this podcast, is to provide you with quality content that encourages and supports and even motivates you in your spiritual formation and your engagement in it, and also supports the mission of introducing the next generation to the ancient practices of silence and solitude and even contemplation. And I say even partly because I think the minute somebody hears contemplation, they think, well, I'm no contemplative or I'm no mystic, or that's not it at all. And I'll leave it at that. I can talk a lot more about it because I've done a fair amount of study of recently about it. So, what are we talking about tonight? This ought to be good because it's not terribly well scripted. Not that I script much of anything that I do on this podcast. But the topic I want to spend some time talking about is grace, which is one side of this topic that, quite honestly, between you, me, and the hedge post fence, I think Christians have a pretty jacked up understanding of grace. They have a great understanding, a theological understanding of grace. But when it comes to living it out, even within their own heads, they have a really jacked up understanding of grace. And one of the places that it shows up, and I've been having some series of conversations around this since I'm doing a class in shame and grace. And of course, I coax, coerce, irritate students into journaling for me and sharing those thoughts in their journals with me. And the conversation that has been percolating the last couple of weeks is, where does good boundaries fit in with grace? And just the question itself betrays how do I want to say, bastardized our concept of grace is. Because we see grace as giving somebody license to do anything they want. And that is not grace. And so when it comes to talking about boundaries in terms of me and not me, what I'm responsible for and what I am not, how do I relate to somebody who maybe doesn't respect my boundaries, the boundaries that I set? Now, let me be really clear, okay? Because when I talk about boundaries, the first thing that comes to most people's minds is building a wall of separation between me and another person. And I can sit behind that wall and be as selfish as I want, take care of my own needs, not worry about anybody else's. And that, too, is a huge, huge distortion about boundaries. I think the better way to think about boundaries is like a chain link fence that demarcates my yard, what I am responsible for, namely, clearly, my heart. And so when somebody acts in such a way, let me lay this out. Because if I invite somebody into my yard that I'm responsible for, that has this thing called my heart in it, that I've been told to watch over with all diligence, and then they blow it or don't handle it very well, then how do I set limits on that person and move them outside of my boundary, inviting them to leave or creating distance or whatever it is I do? And how can that be gracious? By the previous definition, it's not. In other words, it's being nice, it's overlooking things, it's saying it's okay. And quite honestly, I don't think that's grace at all. And so let me tell on myself a little bit here to illustrate this very point, okay? Now, it takes some background. And one of the reasons that I have been offline for a couple of weeks is last week I did a pretty big workshop, and I had a lot of preparation to do for it about the habits of the heart, what I call the way of the heart. And so I simply ran out of time. And Lynn and I, my wife, decided that it was time to get out of Dodge for both of us. We were pushed and overwhelmed and just demanded of, and we just needed to unplug and get away. So we pack up the camper, take off for Estes Park, north of the Denver area and into on the edge of Rocky Mountain National Park. And we set up camp and set out something for us to do the next day. And we decided that it would be nice to take maybe a 4-mile hike and just take it easy and see some areas of the trails that we haven't seen before. And that's exactly what we did. Next day, we got up and at our leisure, as the British might say. That probably is not, but that's just my stereotype. So we got up, had breakfast, got ready, threw our boots on, and off we went. And the major issue in my mind was our map sucked. It was not very good. But I figured I could compensate for it because I knew the trail well enough and I knew my way around. I could probably figure out how to get to where we wanted to go and get back again in this 4-hour hike. Well, the long and the short of it is we ended up hiking 8 miles and 6 hours later. And it was not pretty. It was really not pretty. And the probably 2.5 to 3 miles of that was accounted for by my just pure stubbornness and don't go down that road of thinking like, well, you're a male, you don't ask for directions, blah, 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 blah. Well, go suck an egg. I mean, I was sure that we were on the right path. And the problem with heading down a lot of these paths is you're sure you're seeing things that are familiar to you. And if you've done any hiking at all and you have even an ounce of empathy, you would agree, okay? And I'll just let it sit there, and if you be convicted, go for it. So we're heading out thinking we were heading in the right direction. We bump into this guy who's standing by a pond, and we say, hey, how you doing? We always get some pointers and trying to gauge how much farther we can go. And there was a particular landmark that I was looking for to know where we were. And basically, it was a water tower, and it was a water containment system for one of the campgrounds. And we asked him, hey, by the way, have you seen this water tower? And he got this interesting look on his face and said, I don't think you're where you think you are. And at that point, my heart pretty much sunk. And I'm thinking, how much farther out of the way did we go? And now we're going to have to retrace our steps, which exactly is what happened. And we took a 1.5 mile detour and retraced our steps back to the junction where we made our mistake, corrected it, but still ended up someplace that we really didn't want to be. And I was sure, and justifying myself the whole way, I might add, really well, actually, I could probably get a prize for it, that this was going to be a shorter thing, a shorter distance. So we get to this lake. If you've ever been to Rocky Mountain National Park, it's called Lake Sprague. And it's an ADA accessible path around it. So it was an easy walk, but by that time we'd already traversed another 4 miles already, feeling both pretty worn out and pretty tired. And we were walking along, and I was having this incredible rising tide of being discouraged that every time I made a turn, it was the wrong one. And I said something to the effect of, I'm pretty sure that this is the way we should go, but you have absolutely no reason to believe me because I have been wrong on every decision we've made so far, so I just want to quit. And my loving wife, knowing what is hers and what isn't hers, what boundaries there are, okay, and she's invited in, all right, to my yard, if you want to call it that. And she said from behind me, because she was following at the time, she said, if you want to go that way, you can. And this was truly an oh crap moment, because she had a myriad of responses she could have made, like being silent, which would have confirmed my belief that I deserved every ounce of shame I was beginning to pile on myself. Or she could have said, no, that's okay. We're going to be fine, blah, blah, blah. She didn't do that either, which would have probably not consoled me, because I was already well on my way on the toboggan run into full-blown shame attack. And all she said was, if you want to go that way, you can. And I pulled back on the reins and had a dose of grace from my spouse, enough to say, yeah, I made a mistake. And it has cost us dearly. We're both hobbling back to the campground. And all the way back, it was part of that. And there wasn't really anything else to be said. Now, what does that have to do with grace and boundaries? Well, the boundaries part was, it was not on her, the decisions that were made. I was arguing quite vociferously, I might add, for my perspective. And she went along with it. She had her arguments with it as well. But I pretty much won the day, because I tend to generally have a sense of direction. And we were both fairly turned around no matter which way you cut it. I hadn't brought along an accurate map. I hadn't brought along a compass. We are far more veteran hikers than that, and we made all the rookie mistakes that people would make. But the grace that was displayed within the bounds of the boundaries that were kept was giving me a choice to handle my shame as I saw fit. And that was a gracious thing to do. As a matter of fact, the grace that was showed me actually freed me to get out of the shame cycle and to recalibrate myself, because it was clearly mine. It was not hers. And grace is an act that empowers other people to live within the boundaries that are theirs. It is not ever a guarantee. Grace is always a risk. So when I offer somebody grace and not act with retribution or punishment or anything else, that act of grace may not turn out. And see, the thing is when I go into it with an agenda and some kind of desired outcome, it's diluted grace. I'm not sure it's grace at all. Actually, it's an expectation of what the person should do in response to this loving grace that I'm offering them. But is it really grace at all? And when you think about it, when grace is offered as a gift, a free gift, which Ephesians says, a free gift of God, lest anybody should boast, then if it's not really free, then it's probably not grace. And I have a thing that I tend to say, and that is trust and control can't coexist, and trust and risk always coexist. And I would suggest to you that grace and risk also coexist. Because I'm offering it because I've been offered it, for one, and I'm offering it to create a space to allow the other person, invite the other person to grow, to learn, and own the fact that they made a mistake, and let's do something different. Let's try something different. And that's how boundaries are supposed to work. Because the thing that oftentimes comes up in this discussion around grace and boundaries is the idea of justice. In other words, if somebody does something wrong, somebody needs to be punished. That is justice. But grace ends up removing, in a lot of ways, removing what some people would say is justice. And why are we so bent on justice? Because we don't give ourselves grace, for one, And we are bent on justice because we see our relationships and things in a balance beam. And I want to keep them balanced, which requires some measure of control. So does grace stop when the person doesn't accept the grace that I'm giving them to make the changes? I would suggest to you no, because it wasn't really grace that was given in the first place. It was actually a package deal for them to change their behavior, and then they would feel the full extent of the grace that are being offered. Anybody can give grace. As a matter of fact, in some cases, I've seen people that aren't even Christ followers better at giving grace, not just winking at bad behavior or blowing past it or saying it's okay when it's not, or any of those things. But I have to be willing, if I am going to live a life of grace, in my relationships, there are two different sides of that coin. One, how do I handle grace with myself? And secondly, how do I see and handle grace in my relationships with other people? In most cases, and I don't have this verified, but I would assert that in a lot of cases, the grace that we offer people is never seen, is not even recognized, but it is still given. And in a lot of cases, for those that are listening that are parents, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The entire course of my children's existence has been dotted and with grace all the way through. And some of it, the grace that is offered, is withholding things that I need to deal with in myself rather than put it on them. So I would suggest that we can handle or hand out grace, extend grace, while exercising justice. And what justice is not saving but somebody from the consequences of their choices. I can support, I can empower, I can coach, I can do consult, I can do any number of things. But when the person suffers the logical consequences of their behavior, including mistreating me and me stepping away and creating some distance between us, that is a gracious thing to do. To our ear and to our way of thinking, that's punishing the other person. When what it is when I'm around somebody who is not acting safe at the time and is saying hurtful things, and I separate myself from them, it is clear that there are consequences based on the behavior that they're engaging in. Does that mean they recognize it? Maybe not. I mean, in a lot of cases, people end up finding ways, myself included, finding ways to victimize themselves at our hands because we are allowing them to suffer consequences for saying something harsh or insensitive or hurtful, and we say, ouch. And they say, what's your problem? I mean, it's not that big of a deal. And so now you're putting it upon me and making me the problem. You see how that works? And so they manage, some folks at least, manage to make me the problem. Now, what does this do to tie in to what we talk about with spiritual formation? Well, the easiest tie-in, of course, is living graciously with ourselves, not forgiving ourselves. Drop that language, because it's not about forgiveness. It's about accepting the grace that we have been offered and learning to live with ourselves in it. And that's far harder than it sounds. All you have to do is listen into the narrative in your head when you do something like I did, and somebody else pays the consequences for my stubbornness and pride and unwillingness to back up and do something a little bit different. And that's a hard consequence to take when you see somebody feeling the pain of your bad decisions. Now, what is my best defense? I can insulate myself with shame. And I can say, I'm a terrible husband. I can't do anything right. I'll never do this again. I'll find a way to make sure that I don't. But that solves no problem here. All it does is insulate me from owning what's rightfully mine and making choices differently the next time it comes around. And you can be absolutely assured that I will be making different decisions the next time it comes around. Not based on trying to avoid feeling shameful, but based on the act of grace that was offered me, and I'm learning, and I can do it differently the next time, so that the person I care about and love doesn't suffer the consequences of my pride and stubbornness. There is so much here that can be talked about and looked at, and it's very much a part of our tendency, and this is exactly what it undercuts our embrace of grace, is our demand for justice. And if that were the case, we would have never experienced grace from God at all. And that's the thing that we have to pay attention to and have to start noticing. Currently in the class, we're talking about people that are candidates for shame. And the more we become aware of how much this operates within the shame-prone culture in the church, because we've substituted shame for being motivated by love and being motivated by the gift of grace that we've been offered. And rightfully so. I mean, if I can say it that way, because grace is way more powerful to make instantaneous change, but not long-term change. And it's harder to deal with ourselves and our humanness and our limitations and our struggles with pride and stubbornness and all of those things. It takes a longer time to lean into those, armed with the grace that we have been offered, and to make the changes in the long term, not in the short term. And so that's the battle we have before us, and grace and boundaries quite naturally fit together because we allow the person that we're in relationship with to experience the consequences of being in relationship with us. And it doesn't mean I need to punish them to get them to change. I actually offer them the grace that's been offered me to invite them to grow instead. And that is the ultimate in graciousness, in inviting them to grow and to say, look, you don't have to do this alone. I'm with you. Me too. I've done this stuff too. I've been that way before as well. So I offer the grace freely. You can choose what to do with it, but we can learn together and we can do it differently the next time. And most assuredly, we will. We change on the basis of an invitation instead of avoiding another failure and changing that way. And that's just a little itty-bitty part. It bleeds into our spiritual formation, because what motivates us to grow deeper in our relationship with God? And a lot of people would hear that and say, love. I love God, and that's what motivates me to move deeper into a relationship. But the challenge we have is the baggage we bring with us that includes this voice of shame that keeps chirping at us about if you'd been better, or if you'd done this differently, if you had been a better person, if you had known this in whatever way, then this wouldn't be happening. And for some people, they jump to, if I wasn't even in this picture, it wouldn't be happening. And see, that's a pretty toxic pattern of shame-based thinking that I identify with. That's been usually my tendencies in some respects, is that I insulate myself from what I see as being a failure by just heaping on all of this extra shame. And the people around me end up saying, oh, look how devastated he is. Let's back off and let him try to get his bearings again, and then we'll get back to it. But see, I've already effectively insulated myself from the feedback I desperately need in order to make the changes that perhaps I desperately want to make. And that's the challenge, because whatever we talk about in psych and faith always bleeds into how we engage this journey we call spiritual formation. And our relationship with Jesus is not just pure. We bring ourselves with us into that relationship, and oftentimes we create the Jesus of our minds rather than the Jesus of Scripture, because that is far more knowable, far more understandable, far more predictable, and I know how to handle that Jesus. But the one in Scripture, I don't know. He is way too unpredictable. There's too many uncertainties. I'm invited to trust, and I'm not sure I want to do that either. I'd rather know the knowable, predictable Jesus than the unpredictable, gracious, powerful, overwhelmingly loving Jesus. That's a tough ask, and I put me at the front of the line on that one. So, food for thought tonight, folks. Because grace and boundaries very much do fit together, and I've kind of scratched the surface. There's so much more that we can get into because we have to define our terms before we start having this conversation. And I've moved into it, laying just a portion of the landscape so that we can be clear about what we're talking about when we're talking about grace and we're talking about boundaries, and then when we're talking about how do they fit together. I had a very vivid example this past weekend. I didn't have to move Linda out because she had taken territory that I hadn't given to her. I had already given it to her. That's what gave her the freedom to say it to me in the first place. But sometimes we have people that move in without our invitation, assuming that they can because of some status or position they have in our lives. And we never really have considered that maybe I need to distance myself from this person, and they're not going to understand it. They may not even accept it. They may get all sideways with me because they don't like those limits that I've set. That is part of my responsibility for taking care of my heart. So, that's it for tonight. Hopefully I've given you something to think about. It's tough stuff. I understand that it is. But the wonder of our relationships, or even the power of our relationships, is reflecting back to one another a true understanding of what grace looks like, with appropriate boundaries, not taking on what isn't mine, respectfully abiding by the boundaries that others set, and still being the support and encouragement and empowering people that we are meant to be with one another. That's part of being a community together. And that's not an easy thing. I know it isn't. And hopefully that will give you something of the landscape. But please, if there are other questions or things that I've touched on or things that have come onto the radar that you say, wait a minute, I didn't really expect this to be part of the conversation, please interact with me. You can interact by leaving a comment on the podcast. You can direct message me through Instagram or other means. Please create the conversation, because it is in that conversation that community is built. And we're all still trying to figure that out in some fashion or another, with a grace-based community, not a community that's built on contracts and shame and all the other things. So I seem to have a thought that is in search of a period at the end. So there you go. And hopefully that will be of help to you. As always, at the end of each program, I give you some reminders. One thing for I think I've covered pretty much everybody, but we have a silent retreat coming up just in a few weeks. And so if you are registered for it on the old website and haven't done it on the new one, please be sure to do that, just so that I can have an accurate head count. I think I've got everybody covered. If you are interested in the spring retreat in 2022, is April 4th through the 7th. Hit the website, go to the drop-down menu, pick that one, and sign up now, because the seats will be going fast for that particular retreat. We have to cap it at 10 students and 2 leaders. And that's the only way that we really have to do that. If you want to secure your spot on the retreat, then use the donation button and submit $50 just to secure your slot for the spring retreat as well. So you can do that. And like I already mentioned, as far as questions and so forth. The other thing is you can subscribe and follow all the content, and there will be more content coming up in the days to come. I am starting to put up the playlist from my class in Shame and Grace, and so you can listen into those lectures that are coming up. We are heading into in the class something that I call the stained glass self, and so if you want to listen in and even watch the video of it, you're welcome to do that. But subscriptions can be done on the website. We have a newly designed website called Out of Ashes. If you go all the way to the bottom, there's a place there where it says keep in touch, and you can enter your email and you will get notifications whenever any new content shows up on the website. You'll be the first to know, and you'll be able to see it that way. You can also subscribe via Instagram. We can be found I can be found. I keep using the royal we. I got to get out of that habit. At the Psych Monologues on Instagram, on Facebook, I can be found at ray.mitsch, Mitsch, and at LinkedIn, drmitsch. So you can subscribe in a variety of places. We are also, there I go again. The podcast, the Psych Monologues, is also available on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, Podbean, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. So you can find us on any platform that you consume podcasts. You can subscribe there as well. If you do that, and even if you listen to us on Apple iPod or podcasts, I would greatly appreciate it if you are blessed by what you're hearing and encouraged. Please leave a review. I'm not much of one to fish for compliments or fish for anything, but if you sincerely believe that the podcast has been helpful, please let others know, because others can come and also hear and be encouraged as well, hopefully. So the other thing that I end with each podcast is that if you're interested in partnering with us in supporting and expanding our scholarship fund that allows students to afford going to a silent retreat, please submit your tax-deductible gifts using the donate button on the website under the Silent Retreats pull-down menu. If you would rather do it through check, you can send it to us, to the scholarship fund through a check. You make your checks out to 1615.tv. I know it's a little weird, but our financial sponsor has offered us this ability to offer for donations a tax-deductible gift, and so you can use that on taxes, which is we're coming up to the end of the year. If you know anybody that is really passionate about developing the spiritual development or contributing to the spiritual development of the next generation of Christian leaders, please encourage them to donate. It would be hugely helpful, and I would really love to be able to see us have a scholarship fund that allows us to scholarship every student and make it within their reach to go, because it tends to be pretty self-limiting when you have a cost of over $300 for a student to go to the silent retreat. Is it worth it? Without a shadow of a doubt. But at the same time, it's still pretty costly. So, getting back to my original point, if you would rather send a check, you certainly can do that. Send it to 1615.tv. That's the address. P.O. Box 1777, Castle Rock, Colorado 80104. So 1615.tv, P.O. Box 1777, Castle Rock, Colorado 80104, and that's where you would send it. that's it for tonight. Thank you for your patience and hanging in. Thanks for the opportunity to sit and go over how we can live in grace with one another with the appropriate healthy boundaries we need to actually be able to encourage one another. And so thanks for joining me. I appreciate your time. And as always, love you. Later. Bye.